Mhm.
I think that's working now.
Yes. Okay, I see the first slide up, so we can go to the fourth one. What is OT? We talked about that. What's sensory processing, which is what I just started to discuss. Okay, and now we're talking about why is sensory processing important? So our central nervous system organizes sensory information, adjusts neural messages about intensity, frequency, duration, complexity, and what essentially happens is we're able to modulate the information. So even right now, for example, if you're sitting and listening to me, you're sitting in your chair, you're able to look at the screen, you're able to engage your auditory sense, maybe you're touching something. All of our senses are working together right now for the ability for us to be able to stay organized and to attend to what's happening during this presentation. You may have some background noises, you may have an impulse to maybe want to touch something, but again, all of that goes back to sensory modulation. You're able to inhibit or facilitate responses based on the sensory experience. For some children, what we'll often see for children who may have sensory processing differences, sometimes we'll see some over responsiveness or we can see some under responsiveness, which essentially means that sometimes when a child is over responsive, they may have some sensitivity. So this may be a child or your child that you may see that have difficulty with loud or busy environments at a birthday party or at the playground or during a transition. And then sometimes we'll also maybe see a child that has some under responsiveness to some input. So this may be a little bit more of a child who's a sensory seeker, maybe a child who's in constant motion, touching items, putting items in their mouth, speaking loudly, needs a lot of sensory information for their nervous system to register it. Why is this important, especially in the school based or just in daily life? You know, we have a lot of sensory experiences, but essentially a modulated and regulated nervous system, you're able to kind of maintain that baseline of homeostasis. You're able to adapt and respond to sensory information adaptively, not over respond, and seek it out, and able to kind of, your nervous system stays in a regulated state. But sometimes for children or people who have sensory processing differences, what we see often is a lot of the behavior, emotional dysregulation, maybe a child who's engaging in that fight or flight or freeze response often. So that they have difficulty really scanning out what's not relevant and really filtering into what is important, which obviously then in turn affects the ability to attend and to learn. When we're calm and organized in our own body and our own nervous system, we're able to focus, we're able to engage with others, we're available for different novel experiences, and we're able to self-regulate. But when the sensory systems are not working together effectively, and there are some sensory processing differences, we will often see the difficulty with self-regulation, essentially our ability to adapt and respond to the situation with appropriate intensity and modulation skills. Okay. I'm just going to talk about, so that's just like some of the nervous system language about what sensory processing is. It is pretty complex in terms of the language, just to summarize it. But I really kind of want to talk about today, you know, maybe some indicators of a child who has sensory processing differences. We all have sensory profiles. But again, OTs are thinking about looking big picture at the child and maybe if some of these sensory processing differences are coming up day-to-day activities and impacting quality of life. These are some behaviors that we may see. So in the classroom, you know, we may see a child who dislikes messy play. You know, maybe they're doing sand painting or finger painting or glue and does not want to engage with the activity because they have some sensitivity to tactile input. On the other hand, we may have a child or a student who can't get enough of messy play, and the teacher gives them a paintbrush or a marker, and they're painting on themselves, and they're immersing their entire body in the sand, and they want a lot of that tactile play. A child who maybe is hitting or pushing or poking others. We may also see a child, this is all related to tactile, a child who has a lot of difficulty with dressing. Toddlers is tricky because obviously there is like a sense of autonomy of like, I want to wear these shoes or I want to wear this, or I have my favorite outfit, and that independence. But it's really when a child's showing distress, hates bath time, hates getting their hair washed, refuses to get dressed, maybe won't engage in some of the tactile experiences. So it in their day-to-day life, they're experiencing a lot of stress around tactile experiences. We may see a child who has poor body awareness, bumping into objects or others, poor spatial awareness, tripping and falling, often poor personal space when engaging with peers or family members. A child who is clumsy, for lack of a better word, or uncoordinated, it's often a connection to the sensory processing system in terms of how they're experiencing their body in space and body awareness. We may have a child who's in constant motion, fidgeting constantly, a child who spins themselves excessively. We know that children have a higher need for movement, vestibular experiences. They can tend to swing on swings longer periods of time, but I'm talking about maybe a child who is in constant motion, maybe has a little bout of bounce in their gait, maybe a child who is toe walking, up on their tippy toes often, is often related to sensory processing differences. And then on the other hand, we may have a child who's very fearful of movement experiences, who gets car sick frequently, who may not engage in gross motor playground play, who may not want to go on swings. And then in terms of auditory and oral sensory, we may have a child that is covering their ears or has difficulty in loud, busy environments, may not like engaging in larger group activities. From an oral sensory piece, we may see a child beyond the age of 2. We should not be seeing, putting objects in their mouth. So putting non-food items in their mouth, or a child who's a picky eater. There is a sensory questionnaire if you ever meet with an OT that an OT would administer to gain more information about your child's specific sensory profile if you have sensory processing concerns. And there's also a school questionnaire as well that usually an OT will administer to see how their sensory processing differences appear in a variety of environments. And then typically an OT would also meet with them in a sensory gym and see how they're responding to sensory information and take all that information together to determine what their sensory profile is. Again, usually what parents are coming for and not specifically the sensor, maybe sometimes the sensory needs when they're coming to me, but it's more some of those difficulty with self-regulation, transitions, emotional regulation, socialization. Those are the long-term goals, the big picture goals that the parent wants to work on. And the OT is really looking at the sensory profile to understand how the child is experiencing the world and then how they can support them to reach those higher level goals. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna move on to self-regulation, which I also feel like is a buzzword along with sensory right now. But what is self-regulation? It's our ability to change your energy level and adapt to the situation appropriate to that specific situation. And in terms of a school setting, I like to use the example of like going from gym or recess to reading and writing. You have to be able to organize all the sensory experiences, organize your own body, and adjust the intensity and frequency and how you respond. So obviously how children perform in gym and recess is going to look very different than the reading or writing. But if you're able to self-regulate, you're able to adjust and go from maybe to a higher intensity to a lower intensity, maintain that homeostasis and adjust to the energy level. At this in toddlers, a lot of regulation, the self-regulation skills are building just because cognitively in their brain, because of brain development and how the brain develops in terms of the cortexes and where they need support. A lot of it happens through co-regulation at this point, which they probably get a lot of from mom and dad and teachers in terms of being able to respond to them in a calm way, give them some regulation tools. But self-regulation does not fully develop much until later in life. And I like to explain it to parents as, we also, I we say that you develop the ability to self-regulate at the age of 21. That's what research says, but I've met many, many people and adults who have not developed that skill. It's a work in progress for a lot of people. When we take a step back and think about how we self-regulate, an OT often talks about how we use sensory tools to help us self-regulate, right? So we use exercise, we use breathing, we may doodle, we may fidget, we may chew gum. So it's thinking about really kind of bringing down, thinking about those strategies, and usually an OT will kind of help guide a family or a teacher on different strategies that they can implement so that they are able to self-regulate throughout the day, and proactively. So just giving them some sensory tools to help them and throughout the day. And sometimes that may look like a fidget, or that may look like a breathing strategy, or a jewelry, or a movement break in the classroom. Okay, let's see. Self-regulation. Okay, and what are some signs of difficulty with self-regulation? Some behavior that you may see and difficulty that you may see are things like that fight or flight response, going, oftentimes just fleeing the experience or fighting, freezing, the nervous system shutting down, and not being able to engage. Meltdowns. I put meltdown slash tantrums because meltdown, a sensory meltdown can be for hours and not a typical toddler tantrum, over something that's typical in terms of toddler development. I want the red cup, you want the blue cup, and we're talking more about having a full-on sensory meltdown maybe in the playground because it's too much in terms of the sensory information. Decreased social skills. You may see difficulty with transitions, as I mentioned earlier, following classroom routines or directions, trouble with directions and motor planning. The motor planning essentially refers to being able to have an idea, it's called praxis, being able to have an idea, being able to motor plan and coordinate, and then being able to adapt and respond. So in an evaluation in a classroom, that may look like a child had difficulty sequencing how to unpack their backpack or how to put away a work during a work cycle. This can be an indication of maybe some sensory processing differences. Inattention, maybe a child jumping around from one activity to the next, so has difficulty selecting a work or an activity at home and staying with it. Difficulty with focus for an appropriate period of time, depending on their age. And oftentimes, from a personality perspective, we may see a child that wants to exert a lot of control. If there is some sensory sensitivity, it's a coping strategy. We may see a child that's very sensitive or slow to warm up, if they're also sensitive. And we may see a child who has, kind of more difficulty with body awareness, force, being very physical with peers, if there are some more of those sensory seeking tendencies. Okay. We'll talk about sensory and self-regulation strategies, because I think for parents and for anyone who works with children, that's the most important part. I find when I do a workshop, they kind of want to know a little bit more of like, okay, this is great information, but what can we do at home? And OTs really talk a lot about what you'll see a lot in suggestions are like the power of movement-based activities and heavy work activities. So usually when we're engaging in an activity that provides proprioception, which is deep pressure to our joints and muscle tendons, there's a neurochemical effect. It actually decreases cortisol, it increases dopamine and serotonin. There's science behind, this is the science behind weighted blankets and weighted items, and why they've become very popular over the years. OTs have been used for a long time to help ground children. So I always tell parents, when in doubt, go to heavy work strategies, big gross motor play, pushing, pulling, deep pressure massages, yoga, having a child engage in chores, pushing, holding the door opening, wiping down furniture, pushing furniture, jumping and crashing into pillows. A lot of things that provide deep pressure are really organizing for the nervous system. So always when in doubt, I always suggest heavy work activities if there's a child that's having difficulty staying organized in the classroom setting. For a child who's maybe more sensitive, we may want to try exploring more calming strategies, things that are more like tactile, more soothing. So engaging in different tactile sensory bins, different music, breathing strategies as well are really helpful for regulation. I would also say that I think in my career, strength and motor skills continue to change in our developmental guidelines when we're expecting children to reach certain developmental milestones. So, for example, children used to be walking at 10 to 12 months, and now it's much later, 14 to 16 months, per the CDC guidelines. And what the research is showing is that children are just more sedentary. Core strength is significantly decreasing as well. And it's just because more technology, as we all know, less physical time. So when a parent comes to me and has concerns about their child's behavior or self-regulation, I'm always asking about nutrition, I'm always asking about sleep, and I'm always asking about physical activity. And those three physiological pieces are really important to always consider when we're looking at self-regulation and how to support a child. More often than not, I'm finding that children who sometimes come to me who are sensory seekers are not getting enough outdoor time or only getting a half hour a day of physical activity. For the age of 2 to 5, research shows that children should be outside getting gross motor activity for 2 to 3 hours per day. And just because of lifestyle in New York City, sometimes that just doesn't happen. So I sometimes work with parents on finding creative ways to kind of incorporate movement at home, setting up activities or obstacle courses at home, and setting up some different sensory activities to help with nervous system regulation. Some other things that OTs may implement are called sensory diets. Not a list of food that you're going to eat, but this is kind of more exercises and things, again, to implement into your day-to-day routine and to your lifestyle, where you're nourishing the nervous system and giving the child a lot of opportunity for regulating sensory input. So we're also operating from a state of proactive versus being reactive. If you've ever tried any regulation strategies or a breathing strategy or a movement strategy when the child is in fight or flight, it doesn't work. And you may have had that experience already. The best thing is usually just to kind of co-regulate, help keep the child calm, help keep them safe, get down to their eye level, lower your voice, acknowledge how they're feeling. It's not a teaching moment. The teaching moments always happen when the child is regulated. So sometimes reflecting back, maybe in bedtime when the child's relaxed and you're cuddling or reading a book, that's a time to talk about. Or maybe when you're walking on your way to school in the morning, when a child is regulated and available, that is the time to have those conversations. But actually what happens when we're in fight or flight or dysregulated, the part of our brain that accesses language and reason completely cuts off. And the same is true for adults. So when we're dysregulated and somebody's trying to tell you to calm down or take deep breaths, usually you don't want to do those things. You usually have to kind of build the habits and the awareness first and have those conversations and explore those strategies when you're regulated. We never want to explore the strategies in a classroom or with a child when they're dysregulated, because they're most likely not going to be effective. So can't drive home that point enough about the proactive piece. And that's why the sensory diet that an OT creates for a child in the classroom setting or in the home setting is really important, because it's just layering in and weaving in these moments of regulation and grounding throughout the day versus being reactive. Oftentimes parent caregiver education and support, and sometimes you'll also see OTs implement some regulation programs. Some of you may have heard of things like the zones of regulation or the alert program. And these are just really helpful from a parenting and teacher perspective, because it helps talk about emotions and energy levels in a neutral, positive way, gives language around different feelings, different energy levels, and how to help a child identify. I really like for this age group, toddlers, a little bit more like the alert program. The younger ones, I like to use the alert program. It's called How Does Your Engine Run? And it teaches kids like their body's an engine of a car, and sometimes it goes fast and slow. Sometimes in the middle, just right. And then it teaches them, it moves on to teaching them, like, I'm running really fast. How do I slow down my engine? I'm running really low this morning. How do I rev up my engine? For older kids, you'll see OTs use the zones of regulation a lot, which identifies different states of arousal and feelings in different colors. same idea. It's just getting that visual, that kid-friendly language of, okay, I'm feeling in the red zone. What are some of those feelings? Angry, out of control. How do I get myself to the green zone? I really like these two for classroom management. And language in the classroom for social emotional development. They're created by OTs and psychologists, and they're very effective in terms of language carryover, parents using them, as well as schools using them to help just build awareness. Again, it's not behavioral in nature. It's not you're in the red zone, you're in trouble. It's I'm in the red zone, okay, acknowledging it. How do I get myself to the green zone? Lastly, so that's about it for self-regulation. I want to have time for questions. I won't talk so much about fine motor and visual motor skills because unless Susan, do you think it's helpful for me to talk about the fine motor, visual motors piece? But I find that the Montessori
If-
tend to have that so much weaved in.
If you want to just, it's so interesting. I think it would be great if you want to just go over it, maybe
Sure.
quicker.
Sure. So, as I had said earlier, pediatric OTs also understand fine motor development. We do perform standardized evaluations, and there are developmental milestones that have been created by pediatricians and physical therapists, occupational therapists to help us determine maybe when a child needs support. So there are standardized measures that OTs will use. If a child comes to me, a parent has concerns with their fine motor skills, I may do some testing to see where they're at so we can establish a baseline if there is a delay, or if they just maybe something, I may just suggest, hey, start working with these kinds of crayons at home or these types of puzzles to help the child. But fine motor skills are the small muscles in our hand, allow us to do lots of coordination activities with our forearms, our wrists, our hands, our fingers, really helpful for coordination and dexterity. And that translates to having good, strong fine motor skills, strong visual motor skills later on in their academic career, being able, handwriting, self-help skills, using a fork and knife, shoe tying. So an OT is skilled in being able to assess their fine motor skills. There are different very specific developmental milestones in progression. So for example, when a child is 3, we want to start to see between 3.5 and 4, we want to start to see more of a tripod grasp on a writing utensil. There's a progression even with grasping skills. So 1 to 1.5, you'll see this. 1.5 to 2, you may see this. There's all different names from. I won't bore you with the technical names, but this is 2.5 to 3. This is called a digital pronate grasp. This is called a quadruped grasp. This happens between 3 and 3.5. Then you want to see a static tripod, then a dynamic tripod. So there's a natural progression that actually just quite fascinating for humans in terms of how we learn how to grasp items even with our hands. So if a child is struggling with handwriting, maybe when they're 5 or 6, and they come in and they have an awkward pencil grip or not a functional pencil grip, then OT may work with them on developing more of their grip strength, more of the coordination, dexterity in their hands to help them with the goal of getting better to be able to write more independently. Visual motor skills apply a little bit more to like pre-writing skills. So being able, again, there's a developmental progression in what we want children to achieve. They give you a few months, and I try not to go so by the book because I think every child does develop in their own way. But some of the skills that we may see, for example, are a pre-writing skill. Drawing a vertical line comes first, then a horizontal line. Drawing a circle comes at around age 3. Drawing a cross comes at 3.5. Drawing a square comes at around age 4. So sometimes I'll have a family come to me, they're 4, they're not writing their name or coloring yet, but there's also understanding the developmental progression. A child should be able to write shapes and be able to color, cut before they're even really working on handwriting skills. So there is, understanding those developmental expectations, I think, are really helpful to help gauge where your child's at and how to support them. And visual motor also refers to like eye-hand coordination activities, being able to catch and throw a ball, being able to complete age-appropriate puzzles, different block designs. Like I said earlier to Susan, I think a lot of this is not a lot of fine motor and visual motor activities are really integrated into the Montessori programs, which I think is great for so many kids. There's a lot more hands-on sensorial work and a lot of activities that really help develop the fine motor skills. But are your child having difficulty with any of these skills, cutting, holding items, using a utensil, and OT may help support them there. And then gross motor skills are the larger motor skills, the whole body movement that involves the core, upper body, things like jumping, things like balance, stair negotiation, being able to run, to jump, postural control, being able to sit upright at the table. An OT will also look at these skills. There's lots of overlap between OT, pediatric PTs and OTs here, especially in a sense because I own sensory gyms. There's a lot of overlap when we have PTs. We do a lot of gross motor activities because oftentimes they're more related to the sensory processing piece. But an OT also understands, you know, when a child is age 2 to 2.5, for example, they should be able to jump forward with 2 feet, and they should be able to catch a ball with 2 hands. So again, there's some gross motor milestones that we will also assess in OT. Okay, I think that's all I put. Yes, that's it. I went out of time for questions. I put a, you know, we have my offices are called Spring Ahead OT and Bloom OT. My Bloom OT offices are in Brooklyn. Spring Ahead is in Union Square. But if there are any practical questions or any things that you want to know, I see that I have 2 in the chat that I can talk about first. Okay, so you mentioned something about OT helping with difficulty transitions. It's super interesting. I didn't realize it was related. Can you speak more about this? So yeah, so it goes back to more about the self-regulation. So for a child to maybe stop what they're doing, being able to respond to the demand and regulate and have their response, that affects their ability to transition. Also, the cognitive process in terms of like the executive function and the praxis happens during a transition, right? So there's lots of steps that happen in a transition. Sometimes it just looks like this as the adult, like, oh, just clean up, put the things away, right? But for a child, they're still learning the motor planning, the praxis, the ideation. Okay, I have to put the blue block away first. So I have to carry this here and put it away. There's lots of steps that are often involved in a transition. So an OT often will work on multi-step processing, the motor planning, the executive function of planning and organizing that needs to happen in a transition. Sometimes we forget that as an adult because it's so automatic to us because we have those skills. But for a child who's still learning how to sequence, how to do all those motor skills that are required often in a transition. I use cleaning up as an example because I just feel like that's one that most people see as a difficult time for a lot of kids. And OT is really, again, clinically really looking at all the steps and skills that are required to help the child transition. And then there's the self-regulation piece. So for transitions, things like countdowns and singing are helpful. Breaking down the steps are really helpful when we do this. And then we're going to that, really breaking up the day, even though there may be a routine and flow of your day. If your child's 2 or 3, they have an idea of what the day looks like, but they don't know it yet. They don't have it mastered. They don't have the working memory skills for it quite yet. So you really want to break down activities. When we finish cleaning up, then we're going to have dinner. When we finish bath time, then we're going to put on our pajamas. Sometimes visual schedules are really helpful for kids. You know, those kinds of visual charts that really help break apart what the day is going to look like. That's really helpful. And always my advice too for transitions are making it playful, making it fun. Kids are told a lot what to do all day, to be honest. They have lots of demands on them. So, you know, making things fun, a transition, if your child's having difficulty with transition, I tell parents oftentimes to make it fun or playful or interactive. How fast can you clean up all the blue blocks? You know, let's race to the door. Sometimes I'll add movement into the transition. Let's crawl like a cat. We'll put on our shoes. It sounds silly, but it does help with the engagement and participation in a transition. So an OT usually will kind of help families think a little bit creatively about transition. For Naomi, was that response helpful? Did you have any other questions?
No, that was really helpful. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. And for Olga, okay, my child is 4 years old, puts things in the mouth. respond to hard drugs, it will eventually go away, but it hasn't. So just stopping things in his mouth. I would try, it depends on how you respond. I would say it's always best to redirect. In those moments, I think when a child's still putting things in their mouth, we're often saying, no, don't put that in your mouth. And then they're testing boundaries too at age 4. They want to know how you're going to respond. Redirecting, chewy, crunchy snacks, things that are really resistive. For example, like dried mangoes, jerkies, biting into an apple, biting into a chewy bagel, things that are really, really resistive, give a lot of oral sensory feedback. I would also explore different spices and sour, like things that are very, very alerting and have very strong flavors. You may be searching for more feedback. So an example could be just experimenting with temperature, frozen items, sour items. I have some kids who love to put things in their mouth, like they really love like sucking on a lemon, for example, or having like a fizzy water with really a lot of ice, something that has really, really strong sensory feedback. Can also try vibrating toothbrush. They make chew necklaces as well, like necklaces that kids can wear that have like a Lego and a silicone that they can chew on. It's probably very organizing and regulating. So it may not go away or may fade out. But I think it's about, in this case, slime to hard objects, it's always for me a concern about safety and germs, so when I have some kids putting like marbles or toys in their mouth, it's obviously alarming. So we want to kind of think about different ways for him to get that similar sensory feedback more safely. Yeah, chewy crunchy like sucking from a straw as well. Smoothies or a silly straw. I would also go to Party City and try those like blowing a pinwheel, blowing bubbles, those little party favors where you have to blow on, giving him a lot more of those experiences. It may seem counterintuitive and you may say, well, is this going to make him put more things in his mouth? No, it won't. It will actually help him probably figure out like these are safer items. It will satiate that need. And I think over time, it will go away. I also try doing a lot more heavy work exercises, more deep pressure, more calming strategies. When we're biting and chewing, we're engaging our TMJ joint. Our TMJ joint is one of our major proprioceptive receptors. So we're getting a lot of deep pressure and proprioception there. So I would try doing a lot more activity, chewy, crunchy snacks, deep pressure massages, heavy work activities as well.
Thank you so much. It really helped a lot.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other questions? I think those are the 2 questions in the chat, but does anyone have any questions?
May I ask a follow-up question just on the oral
Sure.
sensory? Is it just that child just tends to have more of a interest or, be directed in that? It doesn't actually mean that they're indicative of a larger issue, correct?
No, doesn't mean that. I mean, look, you may know adults who chew their pens and chew gum all the time, it doesn't. And they're, like I said, people who have sensory processing differences, we all have different needs. It doesn't necessarily indicate that there's something more. Sometimes children or those who have sensory processing differences may be neurodiverse and may have something else going on, but it's very common that that we can be neurotypical and just have sensory needs.
Got it. Thank you so much for clarifying.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Any other questions? Susan, any questions? Anything you wanted me to touch base on?
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm glad it worked out. It was very
Me too.
interesting. and-
Apologies, I was late.
No, it's fine. And thank you so much for joining us. And I hope
Thank
that you'll come
you.
back again.
Yes, thanks, Susan. And if anyone would like to contact me, Susan, you have my information for any family who would like any further follow-up questions, feel free to email me.
Wonderful.
That was really great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.